I don't know what the point is, Teft grumbled, but it seems pathetic to give up. We should keep fighting, right until those arrows take us. You know, journey before destination.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello, everyone. I am Elle. Welcome to The Storming Journey, where today we are covering chapter 43 of The Way of Kings, titled The Wretch. I will be your Ardent for today's episode.
I'm Adam, and I am today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Liz. I'll be your Veristitalian.
So today's world singing relates to the latter half of the chapter when Kaladin is starting to return to the wretch and return to that depressive being who is very much inside himself and is trying not to become that way. And specifically, I'm relating it to the mantra that he comes up with, or that he tries to give himself, where he says, don't think about the future. Don't think about what will happen. Just survive. Don't care. Don't despair. Just be. And he's trying to endure through this moment of becoming like the wretch. And I relate that a lot to how I dealt with being gay in the church, and how I would always come up with a mantra whenever I had gay thoughts or whenever I was dealing with my identity. And it helped me to, endure back into living like a good Mormon boy, not gay, basically. And the mantra was always something like, I would always say my name, and then I'd always tell myself that I'm a son of God, and I'd always remind myself that I'm the holder of the priesthood. I would always tell myself that I, lived a mission, I made covenants in the temple, and it was this mantra that I would always repeat over and over again whenever I felt myself. Usually it was after I went on a date or after I hooked up with someone, and it would be a way of enduring back into becoming Mormon again in some ways, or trying to deal with the cognitive dissonance that I was dealing with during my senior year at BYU. And as I, was trying to be at BYU, be Mormon, but also as I was developing my relationship to my sexuality and things like that. So I relate a lot to Kaladin's mantra against his depressive self, because I created those mantras for myself in order to endure that time.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that. Today's Storm's Eye view goes like this. Back at the Bridgeman's camp, a new Bright Lord has shown up. Kaladin sasses the Bright Lady and ends up taking a beating. Bridge 4 is permanently assigned to chasm duty for efficiency reasons. Going down into the chasms gives Kaladin flashbacks to the honor chasm, and he snaps at several of his bridgemen, stuck in the mindset that they're all going to die. Kaladin tries to get back into a more neutral mindset, and Teft encourages him to think about journey before destination. Syl returns and encourages him to keep trying, and Kaladin proposes a plan to train the bridgemen to escape.
So, the theme for this chapter is endurance. This is a hard chapter. This is a hard chapter for me right now, specifically at this very day part of my life, because of my mental health and how that is. And so if this is not an episode you want to listen to about hard things, this will probably be an episode about hard things, and it's okay if you skip this one for now or forever. Endurance is a really interesting idea to me. My first thought was persistence, and then it turned out we had already done that theme, so doing what we like to do, which is find a synonym for an idea we originally had. And to me, the idea of endurance really felt relevant to Kaladin's experience, because it feels like Kaladin is enduring his life right now. He is just kind of continuing to get through his life. And it doesn't feel like that endurance is much of a choice. I personally don't feel like my endurance is much of a choice. The way that I was thinking about it, is a lot of times when people talk about depression, they contextualize it. Depression and suicidality are often like hand in hand, and it's almost always like depression is bad because it leads to suicidality, and that's bad because that leads to a person's death, and that's not good. But like my daily experience of depression is more like I have a headache, but it's emotional. And like I'm not actively wanting to die. I'm not even actively wanting to not exist most days. It's just kind of like a constant headache that I have to endure. It's like I can't take ibuprofen and Tylenol for this. It doesn't go away. Can't take a headache medication. And so it's not really a choice to not endure or to endure because there's not a way out. I don't have a solution. The only option is to endure or not. And so Kaladin, I really identify with Kaladin in this chapter because he is in this situation where he is a bridgeman. There's not a way out. He has decided to not give up and die, which he very easily could have with the storm wall. He didn't make that decision with the honor chasm. So I want to talk about like Kaladin's role or Kaladin's endurance in this chapter, the idea of endurance as a choice, and like whether anyone else in this chapter we see as like enduring or not enduring.
This is a really, really tough chapter to talk about because I think it's difficult to be like, here's what Kaladin should do better so he can endure happily. Like, that's not the attitude I want to have. And yet, like, so much of the chapter is the contrast between the way, where Kaladin's mind is at this point and the places that other people's minds are at, right? We have Rock who's telling him, Bridgman life's just a difficult life, so we just have to keep doing it. We have to keep fighting. And that makes Kaladin really frustrated. And Teft kind of does the same thing. He's like they need some encouragement from you. He's trying to be positive and build something. And Kaladin is just not in the mindset where he can do that. And I don't know what makes the difference between people's ability to endure in different ways, right? Like, it's not like Rock and Teft have had an easy life compared to Kaladin, right? They've both had really bad things happen in their past and lost a lot of people that they loved. But they just somehow have a different attitude towards this than Kaladin does. And it's difficult to say what exactly makes the difference or if it's like desirable that everyone endures in this more optimistic way that we see Rock doing, for example.
I think about the fact that when I was growing up in the LDS church, there were 4 principles of the gospel, which was faith, baptism, repentance, gift of the Holy Ghost, and then endure to the end was the 5th one. And like technically in there's like going to the temple and making covenants in the temple, but like it was always, and then endure to the end. And it was like, that was the rest. That was everything afterwards. And I was like, okay, that's a lot. And a lot of the talks around enduring to the end were like enduring happily to the end and like trying to make sure that you had this very specific mindset of being optimistic in your endurance, that endurance is a happy thing, that you don't agonize your way through endurance. And I think there's a couple of factors. I think there is like a predisposition that some people have to enduring happily, I think, and that makes it really easy if you happen to be an LDS church leader and you get to talk on endurance, and you can be like, it's really simple. You just endure happily like I do because that's how I endure. But I think there's also like factors that like Kaladin seems to at very least have seasonal depression, but also seems to have some other genetic factors where he is depressed and also the oppression that he has. But like for me, my level of enduring is different than other people's enduring. My level of enduring now, 10 years after my depression started, is different than it was the first year I had depression, where I was extremely optimistic that the next med I tried would work. And then I wouldn't feel like I do anymore. And now I'm at I literally don't think anything else right now that's being tried is something that is going to work for me. I have to wait for a clinical study to have a breakthrough, to find something. And so I think it can be helpful and healthy to have an optimistic approach to endurance. But I think what the problem becomes is either when you insist that everyone should feel like that, or that you make it sound easy to feel like that. Because I think at different points of my depression, it has been easier to persist optimistically or to endure optimistically. Like, that's a choice that, like, I have to make to be willing to do, and Kaladin is not willing to make that choice right now.
I think one of the beautiful parts of this chapter is his working through the life before death idea from the first ideal, and how he doesn't come to an optimistic conclusion with that working out, but he's working it out. And for me, when you mentioned like leaders giving talks and saying it's so easy, it's always the easiest way to tell if a person like has not really faced the demon that they've been facing, is when they just like get up there and say, yeah, it's quite easy, like rather than like walking us through the big difficult things of going over. And like there are things that are certainly easy to get over, but at the same time, like there's something about thinking through and staying through that I think Kaladin's doing here, where you don't come to a conclusion, you don't come to an end, you don't come to a joyful, like, now we can move all along kind of thing. And what I was thinking about, this is beyond the podcast, but it's fine, I'll bring it in anyway. At the previous Mormon History Association, I presented on a long project that I've been doing looking at LGBTQ Mormon memoirs and thinking about how they create a rhetoric for themselves and how they create identities for themselves and how they move around the queer identity and things like that. And I read 2 books of people who are gay but married to one person who is of the opposite sex who they are attracted to. And that's how they kind of like frame their identity. One man says, I am gay, I'm attracted to men, but I'm married to this woman who she is, I'm fully attracted to. And then there's a book by a woman. That first book is called Exclude Not Thyself by Skylar Sorensen. And the other book is called Tender Leaves of Hope, I believe, by Megan Decker. And it's about a woman who is attracted to women, but is also attracted to one man. And in the books, they never fully deconstruct is not like, I know that that word has a lot of layers to it when it comes to religion, but they don't fully look into and think through what's happening for them as an identity, for them as a human being in relation to everything else, that they always feel a little bit not as intimate as I would want a memoir to be, compared to in this text where Kaladin is working through this life before death idea. And it's not great. He's like literally before he works through life before death, he is at the edge of the chasm there and thinking, oh, I could just jump and fly for a little bit and that would bring me some joy. And then everything would be done and hunky-dory. It would not be really hunky-dory, but I like that part so much because it doesn't end in optimism, because it also doesn't just leave it with like him going, life before death. Cool story, bro. Let's go change the world, right? There's this working through it that like shows the tenacity that you need for endurance, that shows the depth of thought that you need and the depth of complexity that you need to keep on enduring, rather than just putting everything to the side and enduring. This is enduring through it, not enduring in spite of it in many ways.
It reminds me of 5 years ago-ish. I picked up a book from the library that was talking about being in the middle in like terms of not just religious belief, but this idea of like, it was like middle of hard things, like middle of trying to figure out what you believe. It was in the middle of difficult decisions. And I remember having a lot of conversations with people at the time of saying, we always talk about the hard thing when we're done with it. We like, LDS Church has a tradition of the first Sunday of every month, with some exceptions. People can just get up and talk about a thing. It was fast and testimony meeting. You get up and bear your testimony, and it's an adventure. But a lot of times it's people being like, I have gone through this hard thing, and this is the lesson that I've learned because of this hard thing. But most people don't talk about being in the hard thing. and like what that experience is like of, I don't have an answer of when I will not feel depressed. I don't have an answer of when I will not be a bridgeman with no hope for escape. And I think, like you're pointing out, Adam, that Kaladin is in the middle here. And we get to see that because that is part of the experience we get to see as reading this book, where it's a really hard thing to be in. It's hard to share because you're like, I don't really have any conclusions about this. But it's also just like there's no lessons yet. You're like, I'm not learning anything. I'm existing through it. I'm trying to figure things out. But like, I don't know. I can't give somebody, this is the thing to learn. I just want you to sit here with me in the middle. But you can't really get up and tell people that. You can't, it's hard to get up and tell people, hey, I'm in the middle of this hard thing. Full stop. Or semicolon, I guess, as the case may be.
It's like when you start saying those things, they sometimes feel like excuses, or they sound like excuses, right? As you try to make sense. Like, I think as a society, we've lost this ability to like make sense, right? Like to sit with each other and try to make sense of an event while it's happening, rather than thinking back to it and thinking to those lessons. Like, what did God teach you? All those things. Like, which is a great experience and a great process that you can learn a lot of great things from. But like when you're in the moment, you don't quite want to share things because you'll start thinking, oh, I'm making an excuse for that, or I'm making a reason for this being, even though like I haven't quite figured that out. And it's like we don't have a strong tradition of sitting with the troubles, right? I think that's Donna Haraway's book. Who feminist scholar. Like, is she a queer scholar or a feminist scholar? She is under the umbrella of scholarship. But like, how do we sit with trouble? How do we sit with problems, etc.?
And I think one way Kaladin finds to continue on is just after the part you were talking about, Adam, with him contemplating what life before death means, where he has this paragraph where he's doing some metacognition about what's happening to him. He says he recognized what was happening to him, this melancholy, this sense of despair. And I think a lot of the time when we're in something that's really difficult, it can help to at least recognize that it's happening rather than just experiencing it, right? Like, oh, I know what this is. This is me going through an episode of back pain, or this is me going through an episode of depression. I see that this is what is happening. And then we see the next thing he does is try to remember what worked last time, right? He says, during those times when he was, having his seasonal affective disorder with the weeping, Tien would cheer him up and pull him out of his despair. And it's been harder to do since he's lost Tien. And then he decides, I can have some hope as long as the bridgemen haven't all died. And that's what's going to get me to keep going at this point. And so somewhat, I think, endurance involves metacognition. We have to be able to look at our situation and decide that we should continue on with it, even when it's unpleasant, even when we don't know how it's going to resolve itself. And maybe that's kind of what you were talking about at the beginning, Elle, as well, like that it doesn't feel like it's a choice to endure because you already kind of know that, like, no, I'm not going to give up. But I don't know, like, it's not going to end either. Like, I'm just going to continue. And I have my reasons why. And so I'm just going to continue enduring.
I think it's interesting that Teft ties endurance to the journey before destination. Because Teft's background is with addiction and the experience of addiction and enduring withdrawals at various points of his life or not, or enduring the struggles of addiction, which come more obviously, I think, in Rhythm of War and Oathbringer. And I think it's interesting to have, like, Teft is being the sergeant here, where he's putting aside his own ideas of, like, his personal experiences of endurance or, like, his own hard things to try to motivate someone else. And I think that sometimes can be helpful to have, like, a partner or like someone outside of you to encourage to endure, because then you're not as focused on like your own hardships. It's not like a fail-safe. Like Teft obviously still keeps struggling even as he tries to motivate Kaladin, but it's an interesting, not only like why Teft is bringing this up, but also that like that it's Teft that's bringing this up.
You bringing that journey before destination up in the context of addiction makes me think of the way, well, at least the way that Alcoholics Anonymous and similar organizations are portrayed in media, right? You're encouraged to have someone who's going to walk with you on that journey, but also to like identify yourself as an addict permanently. This is not a destination that you're done with, right? This is something that you build every day. And like, you know, you're going to fall off the wagon at some point, and then you're going to start over and you're going to continue on the journey. So I think there's a reason that journey before destination maybe resonates with Teft.
I think it's, well, the other complication coming from Teft is that he comes from a cult that wanted to bring back the Radiance, right? And so not only is he struggling with addiction and has that history, but he also has this history of like, oh, they all died. And then they also tried to kill themselves to get radiant powers and things like that. And that side of like him dealing with the religious trauma there, right? But also turning to the religious trauma to deal with it. It works great in the broader narrative, right? Because like, oh, look, now Kaladin knows the words to say when he actually accepts being a radiant and all those things. But like at the kind of deeper level thinking through this is I think Teft endures here because he's using his history as a way to transform the future, which I think is like a way that endurance kind of works. And I think is what is pulling out of Liz, your reading of the conclusion, right, is where Kaladin turns to the past to move forward a little bit into the future. And Teft is also turning to the past to try to help Kaladin move a little bit more toward the future and also perhaps help himself a little bit, right? Because it's like he's struggling with his relationship to that traumatic past and also his continuing addiction as he's seeing the actual thing that everyone died for coming to pass and like dealing with that struggle and having to endure through that as well. So I think like there's something in there that I'm sure it doesn't work quote unquote every time, right? To like, especially on different layers of like mental illness or different layers of different experiences. But I think it's something that we can learn from this chapter.
I think maybe the way that we frame it is there's passive endurance and there's active endurance. And I think there's times for both. And like, I mean, in my own life, there's times for actively enduring through a depressive episode because it's worse. And so there are specific things I do. But my like average state is a passive endurance because I've done as much as I can. I just have to passively endure the way I'm feeling because there's nothing more I can do. And I think like in this, Kaladin is like passively enduring his like experience as a bridgeman and a bridge leader, but he by the end is starting to have thoughts of, is there a way I can actively endure through this? And I think like I do think it's different. I think the idea of just saying endurance isn't enough because there are different ways of enduring. You are either enduring passively or you are enduring actively. And I think there's times for both. And if you're pushing someone who's enduring passively to do it actively, that's like a complicated thing that you need to have that's complicated. Just full stop on that. But like, I think there are advantages to actively enduring as well.
And I think we see that in his conversation with Syl at the end as well, right? And about doesn't the fight mean anything, and characterizing endurance as a fight rather than, as he was earlier in the chapter, don't care, but don't despair, just be, right? That's that passive that you're talking about of just let life continue on and happen to you versus everyone in this chapter is trying to encourage him to come up with a plan to fight. What do we do next? And It ends with Sigzil saying, you know, I'd rather spit in their Alethi faces and die on their swords than remain a slave. Like, it is worth it to, like, come up with an active plan instead of just wait for the bridge crew to kill us slowly. It is interesting. And I think there is something about that, like, the making a choice to endure rather than the letting endurance happen to you is a big deal. One of my favorite books as I try to understand depression for the people around me who do struggle with it is The Upward Spiral. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but he talks about how sometimes, like, it is good for us to have this clinical model of depression, that it is something that has genetic components, that has biochemical components, but also the human brain is weird in that it can change itself. And so there is something about making decisions that can improve mental health, and like actively choosing something and choosing to fight against that is something that can actually improve mental health, which seems so weird. And it's not saying that, like, oh, you just need to try to be happy, but it's saying that, like, our brain can change its own chemical expression, which is weird. But it is real.
I wouldn't say like the caveats with that is like,
oh, there are definitely caveats, but like,
I'm just thinking through, like, Kaladin is in this point where, like, people are actively encouraging him to be active. That's not how I would write that sentence. They are trying to cheer him up. And, like, when it comes to mental health in general, like, I just think it's so interesting to think about how, like, something that can be extremely helpful to one person can be extremely harmful to another person. It is such a complex thing to navigate. As someone who's been doing this for the last 10 years, like, I know personally that, like, this is something that has, like, a physiological component. I don't have a way to treat that yet because of how science works, but, like, talk therapy and, like, positive stuff can help, but I already know the limit of that. Like, I've already, like, discovered that. And so, like, when I've tried to have conversations with people about, like, or when I've tried to talk about depression, like, on this podcast, like, I've tried to be very aware of, like, most people do find a treatment for their depression right away, like, within the first few meds that they try. Most people do benefit from having positive thinking and doing cognitive behavioral therapy or other behavioral therapy techniques that, like, change how they think about things. And, like, with Kaladin, I'm like, okay, well, first of all, we do need you to get out of this slavery because that is an active problem here. On the other hand, is there a physiological component? Is there a mental component? And then we get to Rhythm of War where he's, like, developing this level of therapy. And even then he's still struggling. I think I was just like, when we're talking about mental health, it's really complicated. And I see Kaladin struggling with that of he doesn't necessarily want to react, or some of what the others are saying is hurtful because it doesn't feel like he can do that. And at the same time, he's like, but I do kind of want to not be that person. So how can I take some of what they're saying on in a way that works for me right now where I'm at? And that's, I think, my approach generally to, like, mental health is, what do you need where you are at? Or at least what can I help push you a little bit past to get what you need?
And I think this is one of the catch-22s of the text that we're working with, is that we only get Kaladin's perspective. We don't know how Rock is enduring through all the slavery and stuff. Like, we get this positive thing, right? But we don't understand that. We don't understand. We get Tef's experience for a few paragraphs, right? When Kaladin wakes up and it's great. But, like, we don't get all that experience. And I think, like, that's one of the difficulties of the sacred text that we're dealing with is the perspective and keeping it within a third person closed format, right? Which is also issue that we get in Mormonism with the Book of Mormon, right? Where we only get Nephi's perspective of his really mean older brothers who are grumpy all the time. But, like, here, I think, like, we always have to be reminded of the, like, let's think through and build out and have some midrash around the other characters, right, and what they're experiencing, but also have that reminder of that, of like, even in life, each person's experience is different. Each person's reaction to the science that can help them with their depression is different, or each person's reaction is going to be a different way. And so we have to take each thing newly. We can share like, oh, this has worked before this way, or that has worked before based on the relationship with the person. But that person is a new person, a new body, a new chemical imbalance is happening, right? And it's different than another person's chemical imbalance, just as like, my skin is different than your skin, and they all feel different. Like our little skin bodies and skin suits and the Gundams that we pilot are all different. But like, I think that's like a reminder here, right? Is like we each endure in different ways. And I think it's also a reminder though of like, when someone's sharing something, the person who's sharing it has to think through the relationship with that person. And then the person receiving it also has to, I don't want to say has to there, but I can't think of a better verb, but has to like consider that the person is sharing it from a place of love, even if they've been shared 2,000 other times from other people, right? Like there's this complexity to relationships that comes out when it comes to helping each other out. Cause it's like, we're humans. We want to help each other. We're all the same animal or the same species at least. And so I think generally, I would hope we all have this desire to help in a way. And perhaps that help is something that harms, but like at the same time, we have to always like react and act in charity. And that doesn't like remove blame from someone reaching out and doing things like that, while at the same time, like reminding each of us of like, when I get annoyed when someone says something, like, should I really get annoyed with that person or be in a different direction?
No, I think you're totally right that like that's how some of this chapter reads, is that because of where Kaladin is mentally, some of these comments really like get under his skin when they're not intended that way. And that maybe, and when he looks back on them, he comes to kind of the same conclusion. And so we have to work both directions. Sometimes we're the person saying the annoying comment, right? And saying something that someone was not ready to hear. And so we should be mindful of that. But we also have to remember sometimes we're in a bad mood and we take things in ways that they're not intended. And we have to work with that to try to give maximum charity to people who are usually trying to help.
I was thinking about the fact that we talked about Kaladin's kinship or lack thereof a couple of episodes ago. And I think it's a lot easier to like take advice or comments from someone that you trust and respect and like who you feel like knows you. Like, for example, I will probably not be taking any advice of anyone who comments on this podcast if I don't know them personally and they don't know me personally about suggestions for my health. Please don't. That's not what I was asking for. And so like I think Kaladin is a little bit like, I don't know these guys enough. Like, yes, we've gone through hard things together, but like, I don't know them enough to know that they know how to help me or that they understand where I'm coming from enough to like know how to make my trip through life easier. And so I think there's an aspect of, yes, everyone's human and wanting to contribute and make people's lives easier. But I think there's also an aspect of, I'm more likely to trust someone when I trust them to be coming at it from a place of care and a place of, I respect where you are at in your life, and that a book from the Mayo Clinic on how to find happiness is not going to fix me, which I have been given before.
I think that's a really important insight when thinking about endurance, especially in our world of parasocial relationships on like social media or whatever, and like where you go to TikTok to find the answer or to discover that you have X, Y, and Z problem about your body, right? Or about your mind or about who you are. It's interesting because it's like so many people are trusting these parasocial relationships parasocial relationship is like a relationship that's created through like social media with someone that you're never going to meet in life, but you feel like you have a relationship with them because they're saying the right things or because you commented on their videos and they liked something from you, right? That's the thing where it's like, that's a creation of trust, and then you trust that person, so you agree with them that you have ADHD rather than like going to a professional who says you have ADHD. And it's like, you may have that, and that may help you guide you into these different directions. And so it's not, I don't want to like disabuse anyone of a declaration of their own health. But at the same time, like, I think that insight of like developing trust and developing relationships is a way that we come to knowledge, is a way that we come to endurance, is a way that we come to ways of understanding ourselves, is something that is a little bit more fraught in the communication world that we have today, in the world of relationships that are created today, thanks to our investment in social media, thanks to our investment in technology and our investment in where the world's going. But I wanted to think about Syl in this chapter briefly, especially in relation to like the hermeneutic of history that we created earlier, thinking about like how, considering what helped in the past helps you into the future. And Syl is blocked off from her past. Syl is not connected to her past, but she's still there to like help Kaladin in a certain way, which I think we could also read Syl in relation to this conversation of relationships that we were just having, right? Where it's like Syl is creating a relationship with Kaladin, but at the same time, she's just that Windsprint who oddly hangs around, and he, now trusts like it's his mother slash daughter slash, we won't go into any of the fan fiction. But I just wanted to think, what do we think about Syl in relation to this idea of endurance if she doesn't have a history to pull on, and she only has a history that comes out occasionally, right? In her relation to trauma and enduring itself, right? Do you have any thoughts on that, y'all?
I'm now thinking about the idea of like the difference between endurance versus existence. Because like you almost need to have a past in order to endure in the future. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but like that, I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up of like Syl not knowing her past makes her, what she's doing now, complicated.
I think it also sheds a new light on that conversation she has with Kaladin, right? Kaladin says that I can't save them, and she says, are you certain? He says, I failed every time before. And she says, so you'll fail this time too? And thinking about in the context of what we do know about Syl's history, that like her knight died and now she's back. Like she has like a one-time experience where, yeah, her knight died, and that's like her only experience. And she can't even remember that at this point. So, but she seems to have this, again, like chronically optimistic outlook where she's gotten to this point where she's optimistic about the future, even though Kaladin is mortal and will die. But maybe she doesn't know that yet. I don't know. And she's forgotten a lot of the trauma that she had with her first knight at this point.
Well, it comes back up again at the beginning of Rhythm of War, where Kaladin is super struggling. And this is where, like, just after this is where I stopped rereading recently, because I was like, this is too much for me. But Syl is like, I want to understand his dark brain so that I can help him with his dark brain. And then she remembers what it was like to lose her knight. And she's like, oh, wait, maybe I do understand. And there is a shift in Syl when she has that history again of like what it is like to have hard things that you have to live through and the hard feelings that you have to deal with. And I kind of what you were talking about, Adam, when I was mentioning like the talks where it's like a hard thing, oh, you just have to endure to the end. And you're like, this feels like they haven't actually had a hard thing that's affecting them because they're talking about it so positively. And so I'm wondering if that's kind of what Syl is experiencing of it is easier for her. And I'm not saying this is the case for all the bridgemen who are being optimistic, but for Syl, she doesn't remember the hard things. So like, it's easy to talk about endurance in a more positive way or optimistic way because she doesn't have the same memories or the same experiences of what a hard thing is like.
I think it kind of connects to our conversation with maturity and Shallan that we had last episode, right? Where it's like Syl's very immature here, but that gives her the ability to just say, just keep going. Like one step in front of the other, right? It's like when you ask a child, how do I do this? And they say, well, you get up and you go or something like that, right? It's interesting because it's like, it's that innocence mixed with that lack of past that like allows her to say something. And that thing that she says does distill itself into Kaladin, right? And so it's like, it's interesting that it's like, he's circumspect about, and he's suspicious around all the people who have had long histories, but around the creature that doesn't have a long history and that is very different than him as a creature itself, he's very trusting and very like, doesn't agree with her, but like kind of accepts her word without that same layer of suspicion.
Because I think he he has built trust with her already. Like she's been with him in these really low moments we've seen with the honor chasm or at the storm wall, where like we talked about 2 episodes ago, where Kaladin doesn't quite seem to have that same level of kinship with these other men that are with him in the bridge crew. So like Syl even has like some level of bond more than those, and so even her innocent why don't you just try again is something he trusts more because he trusts her already more.
Yeah, I think what I'm wondering is like, if we were a little bit more real with people without as much experience for advice, would that be more helpful advice sometimes? Like a random strange kid, if you like were like, real talk, little kid, here's this, and they were just like, go do this. Like, is there a way that there's like, we view it as truth a little bit more, or we like it does in a different way, right? Where it's like when someone else who's come to us who's had the same layers of endurance and has been enduring up to the same age that we are or whatever, we're just a little more suspicious, even if we've formed a relationship with them. And so I'm trying to think through a potentiality of like, it's like why going to a therapist is like important and things like that, right? It's because it's an objective third party that doesn't quite have a personal relationship with you, a day-to-day relationship, which is different than like a friend, right? You still develop a relationship with a therapist, but it's still someone you pay for to talk to you. And so it creates that layer of innocence in some way to make it somewhat more objective. So I'm trying to think through perhaps that layer of it, because I agree with you about the relationship and the kin making. And so I'm thinking of like a different side to it in some ways.
Maybe it's that like the person receiving it has to be open to it in a certain way. He seems more willing to listen to Sylph because of whatever reason. Like if you are open to, I don't know, hearing a random kid, I think of it as like in general conference, if you're like willing to like listen to it, and whether or not it's like specific words or just ideas, like if you go into it willing to hear things to help you change, then you're more likely to hear things to help you change. So I think it's more like, what is your mindset going into the from the conversation with someone? All right, so we are going to move to the sacred reading portion of our podcast. And normally we've done sacred imagination during the interlude episodes when we're a little bit like on vacation. And I am taking a completely opposite version of that. It is not going to be vacation, but I think that's appropriate for the episode itself. And I don't visualize things particularly well. We've talked about this in our Sacred Imagination episodes before. And so I don't tend to visualize like the war that happens or the physical violence that happens in the books, because that's just not how my brain works. But also, as someone who thinks about history, thinks about people, and who's a bit of an edge dancer, I want to make sure that we are not forgetting the people who died and are in these chasms now. So I am going to read a passage from the chapter. Adam and Liz are welcome to close their eyes and think about this. If you are eating, I would pause here and come back to this episode at a different point in time. But so I'm going to read this aloud, and then we're going to talk about what what stood out to us during our imagining, whether we imagine things beyond the text or things that stood out to us in the text itself. The bodies were piled there, a wall of the dead, arms hanging out, reeds and flotsam stuck between them. Kaladin saw at a glance that the corpses were old enough to begin bloating and rotting. Behind him, one of the men retched, which caused a few of the others to do so as well. The scent was terrible, the corpses slashed and ripped in two by cremlings and larger carrion beasts, many of which scuttled away from the light. A disembodied hand lay nearby, and a trail of blood lay away. There were also fresh scrapes in the lichen as high as 15 feet up the wall. A chasm fiend had ripped one of the bodies loose to devour. It might come back for the others. So, any imaginings or thoughts that you would like to share?
I was thinking about the ginormousness of it all, to use the academically appropriate word there. This is just a huge world, and Kaladin is such a little small boy. I think that's what was coming out to me in this scene, right? There's this giant pile of just like dead in front of him, and the walls just keep going up above that. And they're high enough that you can't, I mean, this isn't written in there, right? Like, but it's brought in more. It's like you can't see sunlight that well in these caverns. And the fresh scrapes in the lichen as high as 15 feet up the wall. And you know the wall still keeps going up above that is where my mind went with that height thing. But it made me think about how, like, we're giving so much of a deep reading to Kaladin. As is appropriate, he's the perspective character, but it's in a world that is such larger than he is. And it just makes you think of like how we're just a speck of dust in the entirety of the cosmos in the universe, right? The Dieter F. Uchtdorf talk, right? Of where it's like, God is so big, but he still loves you. That small little speck in the universe. I don't remember what talk that was, but we'll find it for the show notes later. I think it was in 2009.
Best of luck, Elle.
This is a regular occurrence for me. I'll be fine.
But no, it just like, I think that's one thing that's so grand about Sanderson's work is that the descriptions he gives makes the world seem so much larger than the people acting in it. But the people's actions in it have such an effect on the world, which is what this scene reminds me of. Is the world is so big. The chasm fiend could just come in and kill them at any moment. But there's still these people who are living, who are enduring, who are depressed, who are happy, who are sad, who are enslaved, who are free within this giant world as well. And they're all important to the world.
I kept getting hooked up on the word in the first sentence of it being a wall of the dead, which sounds so much more orderly than the rest of the paragraph. And just thinking about like the sheer scale, like you were talking about, Adam, and then the smell details are terrible. Like I can't even imagine. I do not tolerate rotting smells very well myself. I'm a pretty easy to get nauseous person, and I just cannot imagine being required to work in those conditions, right? They've been put on permanent chasm duty here, and like going back to this day after day after day. I don't know if you would ever get used to it. And just how do you get used to it, to treating the bodies of people as things that you have to deal with as part of your job, right? Especially ones that have just been so horribly mutilated and like by the storm, by the creatures, and also, of course, by each other as a result of war. So just, yeah, it's. I'm glad that you made us stop and think about this a little more, Elle, because it's easy to be like, yay, the chasm chapters, we're going to start training and we're going to escape and it's going to be great. And this is good to think about as well.
It's also the daily reminder that you are also the homo sacer in the army, right? Because it's like those people who are dead are the other bridgemen or the soldiers, and you're both there to be sacrificed so that Thaddeus eventually can get a gem heart. And does that economy trickle down? Probably not too well. Or to get a shard blade. And who gets the shard blade? Your high prince, not you, right? And it's like having to be face to face with the reality that you're in. Like, you see what Kaladin's facing here, right? Is like, he could be one of the people in those piles of people. He probably would be if he wasn't the main character, right? Like, or if he wasn't Kaladin. I'll give him a more appreciative reading than plot armor. Like, being face to face with that is such a mirror moment, is such a mimetic moment, to use the Gerardian term.
I was thinking, Liz, your point of like interacting with the dead as a career or as a job, as a responsibility, like recontextualized current modern day like approach. Like, there are people who do have to prepare bodies for funerals. They have to do cleanup of bodies of people. And I don't have any context for like understanding that experience, what that feels like to them, what that like what their relationship to death becomes, because that's just not something I have sought out and tried, or like had a friend who has that job who is explaining it to me. Like, that's just not something I've interacted with. But like, at the same time, like, I want to understand that human experience. Like, I don't know that I could bear it, but I want to understand it. Almost like in gratitude of not having to do that. Let me at least understand how you feel about what you are doing. And like, just taking some time, like, to be okay with the fact that like, not every job is going to be for me, but like, there are things that are still hard to deal with. What does that mean for someone who is dealing with that?
It reminds me of all the COVID memoirs that are coming out right now, and all the nurses and doctors who had to deal with the beginning of COVID, and just the amount of death from certain hospitals in certain places. I think last year copy edited a memoir from a nurse who, like, it was all about her just like becoming overwhelmed with the entire system and having to deal with that emotionally. Like, it's lovely joint trauma that we can all share, like, not on the same level, but like we can share with Kaladin because of like the joint experience that we collectively have all gone through. Not on the same level, of course, caveat, but in a similar way. That's also what it reminded me of as we've been talking.
So let's go now to the Wisdom of the Heralds, where we share something that we would like to take back with us into our regular lives, that we have learned or thought about from this episode.
I think the main thing that I'm going to take from this episode is considering timing in terms of when I give advice to people who are struggling. I have a lot of people close to me who struggle with depression, and I don't. And so that can often make me a bad giver of advice. But doing a better job at thinking about, is this the right moment to say something, or the right moment to just be with this person? I think that's something I want to improve on.
I think in a similar way, I want to always ask that question before like engaging with someone who's in a hard time. Like, say, like, what the moment is this for you, and just like get their consent in some way before sharing, and how they need it, right, in order to be a little bit more aware of what they need. But at the same time, I also want to be more that way. Like, let other people know I'm free and open for advice. Please give me advice. Or, no, I'm not free and open for advice. Shut up. And just being a little bit more both like proactive in seeking consent, but also proactive in providing consent in that way when it comes to what I'm enduring through and when I need help, or if I don't want help at the moment, right? And being a little bit more open about that.
I think I want to pull from our sacred reading method and try to learn more about some of these experiences that we've talked about, whether that's memoirs. So I guess put your recommendations in the comments, or other people who just have had experiences that I want to be able to empathize with people and to understand where they're coming from, especially in scenarios that I don't interact with on a regular basis, that I don't have context for, but are about what it means to be human and to deal with really hard things.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.